This is Chris Holder, Pastor Chris Holder, Bethel, Dallas. The presentation is Hug Your Cactus, an approach to soul care. I am super curious as to just why this many people are interested in this topic. Because you did read the description, it's like embracing the ugly part of self. Like, so what, just a couple of people, what intrigues you about this?
The title.
Okay. All right.
Messy.
Very messy, and we are in Arizona, and like you can't not see a cactus. I have a staff of 6 that I brought here, and we ended up renting an Airbnb because it was cheaper than 3 hotels. And I did a jog in the neighborhood yesterday and morning, and I have a little cactus garden in my front yard in Dallas, and these are entire yards are cactus gardens. So, I thought we had a lot of cactus in Texas, but this is. Anyone else have any kind of? Yes, very much so. Very much so.
For me, it was just to try to be able to love other people.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And part of that is kind of you gotta love your own cactus before you can love someone else's cactus, and that is true. No, it is. It is. Very much so. It is an incredibly, I guess, relatable metaphor. Like I said, there are handouts, and if we run out of handouts, if you go to hugyourcactus.com, there's a resource page, and you can get them there. Or maybe if like 2 people came from the same church, one would be willing to share. I don't know, but that depends on where they are in hugging their cactus. So anyways. All right, so hug your cactus. Obviously, it's a and we'll get to it in more detail later, but it's a metaphor of kind of acknowledging, accepting one's own brokenness. And I became familiar with this through a friend who shared this with me when I was going through a period of my own kind of hugging my own cactus. I was hugging it and didn't even realize it. But I want to start, and one of the videos I want to play is too big, so let's do this. How many of you are familiar with Elton John? Ever? All right. He represents, in my opinion, if you've seen the movie Rocket Man, it's based on his story, the opening and closing scenes of that movie are very representative of what it means to embrace the ugly part of self. So I was going to show this later, but I want to show it now. I think it sets up the kind of where we're going with this. So when you think about, and I know it's the song that we're going to play is not a very nice song. It's got the word that's not very nice in it, but let's see if why is it not? All right. You're not seeing this, are you?
Nope.
All right. I can fix that. There we go. Now you're seeing it. And this is the back of your mind. This is one of the slides coming up, but think about hugging your cactus begins with crisis, and usually a self-imposed crisis. The problem is me. That's the Elton John we all know and love. And where is he? Yeah.
My name is Elton. And I'm an alcoholic. A sex addict.
Bulimic. Sorry for the sound quality. Shopaholic. Prescription drugs. And anger management. He's got a big cactus.
Well, my dear was out of town. I thought it seemed like you could afford to. Yeah, because I want to get better. What were you like as a child, Elton? As a child?
I know, right? Technology. All right, and then he just goes into the song. So that's all we need from there for now. But so okay, what is the point of that? Is when we start to hug our cactus, when we get to that point where life isn't working, and we're aware of it. But yet when we get there, what did Elton bring with him? Was all his regalia, right? All his, like, all this false self, all this shadow self, all this dark. He came in with that. He wasn't ready to let go of any of it. So that's kind of where it starts. I'll go here with the presentation. So Hug Your Cactus is an approach to soul care. And so then we're going to start with what is soul care, because what does it mean to care for one's soul? And it's an approach to soul care, both taking care of one's own soul, but also how many of you are involved in taking care of other people's soul? If you're now, not just pastors that do that, counselors, friends, if you're a parent, if you're a child, like we're all kind of in this world of, we all have souls that we care for, right? That we help take care of. So, soul care defined. We can define soul care as the support and restoration of the well-being of persons in their depth and totality.
We have an issue. We like salads. We need salads.
Salads. We need salads.
Yeah.
You're in trouble now. No symptoms.
Yeah. Forget hugging your cactus. We've got salad issue here. So we can define soul care as the support and restoration of the well-being of persons and their depth and totality, with special concern for their inner life. The goal of such care can be described as fostering the psycho-spiritual growth of this inner person. So, this is from a book called Care of Souls, David G. Benner. If you're interested in delving more into soul care, it's a really good book, especially from a Christian perspective. But it says, this idea that your soul is what? The core essence of who you are, the deepest sense of self. That is your soul. And that's pretty like the well-being person's in their depth and totality, like special concern for their inner life. When Jesus talks about the Sermon on the Mount and he talks about sin, he doesn't talk about behaviors. What does he talk about? The heart, right? The soul, like the source of. He doesn't say what. He doesn't talk so much about the behaviors themselves. He's saying like what? If you look at a woman lustfully, that's coming from where? Your soul, your heart, your inner sense of self. So that's when we talk about soul care. We're talking about what is the root issue that's there. So, cactus hugging defined. Well, when life is in a self-imposed crisis, we embrace the ugly parts of one's soul long enough to become a person of humility and life to take on new meaning. Now, where does this come from? From the great theologian Robert Downey Jr. Like I said, I was at a pastor's conference and I was explaining just like something I was working on. I went into this program to get a doctorate of ministry. I went to that program thinking that I was going to sort out all these mission models. I mean, I lead a church that's multicultural, and I've helped start mission networks, and like I want to put all that together. And in the middle of that, I realized, no, God's got me here to kind of sort myself out, and one of the assignments we had to do is we had to read this book on church worker burnout. Or what would cause one to fail in ministry or to abandon ministry, or common things that cause people to leave the ministry. And this was before COVID. So, and in that section of that book, so we had to pick one of these characteristics or one of these things that relates to us. So, like if we were to burn out or fail or leave the ministry, what would trigger that? And I was reading it and reading it, and nothing really stuck out. And then there was this whole section on kind of burnout. And I'm a high energy person. So I don't think I'll burn out. But it said some people can be addicted to their own adrenaline and chaos. And I was like, oh crap, that's me. It's like they got me. It's like this. And then later on, it talked about being addicted to attention. I'm like, oh, they really got. This guy last night, he talked about pastors as people pleasers, and so we're addicted to that need for approval. I'm not. I just want attention. I like conflict. Like just don't ignore me. Like in your classroom, like growing up, they put your name on the board if you were naughty. Like you know what I mean? You know what I'm talking about? Like I would just keep going. It's not like, oh, I got my name on the board. Wow, this is great. If I keep doing it, will I get a check? Yeah. But if they put me out in the hallway, that was horrible. Or maybe you know what I mean? So as long as I was getting attention, like good attention is great. Bad attention's not so bad. Like it's a close second place. Just don't ignore me. That's kind of part of my cactus. Is I just want the attention. So, however I can get it. So, oh geez, let's see. There it goes. Oh. There's a little play button there. All right, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna. There it goes. So my friend said, you need to hug your cactus, bro, and sent me a link to this video.
Get sober. He told me not to give up hope, and he urged me to find my faith. It didn't have to be his or anyone else's as long as it was rooted in forgiveness.
Oh, what? Well, that was a good speech.
We can see it fine. Just probably turn it up, maybe.
Yeah, or put the CC on.
It's on full blast, unless there's a volume control in the...
She suggested the CC so we could read what he's saying.
Okay.
Down in the bottom left, if you get rid of that.
Oh, I gotta get back. Let's go back to the beginning.
What would be my right?
Actually, I asked Mel to present this award to me for a reason. Because when I became sober, he told me not to give up hope. And he urged me to find my faith. It didn't have to be his or anyone else's as long as it was rooted in forgiveness. And I couldn't get hired, so he cast me in the lead of a movie that was actually developed for him. I accept the responsibility for my wrongdoings. And if I embraced that part of my soul that was ugly, hugging the cactus was pleasant. He said that if I hug the cactus long enough, I'd become a man of some humility, and that my life would take on new meaning. And I did, and it worked. All he asked in return was that someday I'd be next to him. It's reasonable to assume that at the time he didn't imagine the next guy would be him. Or that someday was tonight. So anyway, on this special occasion, and in light of the recent holidays, including Columbus Day, I humbly ask that you join me, unless you are completely without sin, in which case you picked the wrong industry, in forgiving my friend his trespasses, offering him the same clean slate you have me, and allowing him to continue his great and ongoing contribution to our collective art without shame. He's hugged the cactus long enough.
All right, so that's hugging your cactus. It is that little speech kind of sent me on it, like, okay, how do you unpack that? What does that look like? And then as I started researching it, started just in my own internalizing it and working through it, this became my doctoral thesis. I wrote 120 pages on this topic from that, because I was like, this needs to get out there. This is great. I mean, this is really this is transformational stuff. This is so that's how we got to here. And I actually just submitted my thesis, so I'll be defending it hopefully next month. But that's on a separate issue. But so how do you unpack this? So my hypothesis is this. If you've ever, for a doctoral, you have to do a hypothesis. So it's the cactus hugging metaphor worked as an approach to soul care. More specifically, when one's life or a significant part of their life is not working due to a self-imposed crisis. So we saw that in the video of Elton John, right? Like he got to a point where his life wasn't working. And in the other video by Robert Downey Jr., he says what? I couldn't get sober, I couldn't get work, I couldn't so someone's in a self-imposed crisis. Ever been there? Ever been like, life is not working and guess whose fault it is? Like the only person you can really point to is me. Now there may be, like if you watch the whole movie of Elton John, there are definitely some things that happen in his childhood that are triggering some of this. So it's never, these things never happen in an absolute vacuum. Usually a lot of the self-imposed stuff comes in the way we react to different things. And what's interesting about that movie is it'll go back to a scene from his, like it starts with his childhood, and then every time he comes back to that AA meeting or that support meeting, a piece of his regalia comes off. And then we'll see what that looks like at the end here in a minute. But that's kind of that's part of this hugging the cactus is we all put this kind of false self that we project on the world, and it's slowly unpacking that and kind of getting back to our sense of our core self-sense. So it's an invitation. Cactus hugging, or hugging your cactus, is an invitation to deny or die to self, from what Jesus says, or from a psychological standpoint, die to ego, right? It's a journey from the false shadow or wounded self to discover truer self or essence. Again, like Elton John. His false self was projected in this, like if I create this Rocket Man image, then no one has to see the real me. But we all do that. We all have a false self that we project on the world, and that's what we call the ego. So the ego in psychoanalysis that's the part of a person's mind that tries to match our hidden desires, our wishes of the id. So the part of the unconscious mind with the demands of the real world. So this is all happening in our self-conscious, right? We're projecting these things to protect ourselves because people think if they saw our true selves, they would reject that. So we're going to project this other self because to protect ourselves from that. Does that make any sense? Like so it's why it's called a false self, a shadow self. There's this one great book. It's called the person calls it The Glittering Image. Brandon Manning in his book calls it The Imposter. In the book Abba's Child, but it goes by different names. But it's all speaking to the same reality. And the Enneagram, which we're going to talk about here in a second, it uses the term childhood wound to describe that. Like this, and you see in the video what Elton went back to his childhood self. Like what were you like as a child? And that's where this false self starts to project itself in childhood, and that as some type of protection. Okay, so for my research, I had to develop this theologically. I had to make a theological case for cactus hugging. So I used Paul, and if you want a really good read on Paul, get this book, N.T. Wright, Paul a Biography, because it deals with Paul in the sequence of his life. So it's not just because you realize, like for example, he did not write Romans first. He most likely wrote Galatians first, but they're listed in the Bible based on length. Romans is first of the Paul letters because it's the longest, and Philemon's the last because it's the shortest. But that's not the order of his life. So he, to the best you can, like there's some of them we have a really good idea of when Paul wrote them. Some of them he's not as clear. So he kind of takes the accounts of Paul in Acts and his own biographical accounts from his letters, Galatians being a significant one, and then matches those with the letters. So you're dealing with him in a biographical sense, in a sequence of his life sense. And it's just a different look at Paul when you do it that way. Others have done that, but this is probably N.T. Wright, an Anglican scholar, probably the last 50 years, the best known, one of the top scholars on Paul, does this. So think about N.T. Wright, think about Paul as an example of this. Saul, the zealous persecutor, becomes Paul, the zealous apostle. So when did Saul, when did his life crisis happen? Right. Yeah. His was pretty dramatic, right? Like we all use the term "a road to Damascus experience," even if we don't even know what that means. It's become a metaphor for, this life-changing event. So, what was his crisis? What was Paul's crisis?
Blindness?
No.
Encountering who he was.
Right. What was he doing? Like what his life wasn't working. Why? Because right. He was, but he thought what he was doing was honoring God. He absolutely thought that what he was doing was honoring God. He thought the Christians were the enemy, and as a follower of Torah, as a follower of Yahweh, this is what I need to be doing, is to stamp out this movement. So, and in Galatians, in the letter of Galatians, he says what? I was very zealous for the traditions of the faith, right? I was very zealous for the Lord. Now, when Saul, after his quote-unquote conversion experience on the road to Damascus, did he all of a sudden become this passive, kind of chill-out guy? He was just as zealous for the gospel, right? So the point is, like, when we think about our cactus, our false self and true self, they are kind of two sides of the same coin. Like our strengths are our weaknesses, right? When not internalized, when not integrated. So Saul the zealous persecutor becomes Paul the zealous apostle. But after Paul became it's an interesting fact. Road to Damascus experience happened, probably Paul was in his early 20s. Is kind of the best we can figure. How many years between his Road to Damascus experience and when he started his public ministry out of Antioch? Does anybody know? 13. 13 years. 13 years to hug your cactus, right? 13 years to and it's interesting in Paul in this book. One of the places he goes, it says, is he went to Arabia to kind of for about 3 years, and Paul N.T. Wright argues that he probably went to Sinai. He probably went to this, the same place other prophets went when life, like, to unpack. The point is, he didn't just have this transformative experience and then his life was all sorted out. It took him 13 years. He spent 3 years in Arabia and went back home to Tarsus for another 10 before Barnabas came and grabbed him. And then his public ministry was only about 13 years. So he spent 13 years preparing for 13 years. It's interesting. And those are rough estimates, but so think about that. That's a long time to process, this life-changing experience. But then on the other side of this, when Saul became Paul and then became this evangelist and God rechanneled his passion and his zeal to the gospel and specifically to the Gentiles, did he all of a sudden become perfect? No, his zeal often got him in trouble. Think about Barnabas, like the fallout with Barnabas. Think about John Mark, giving up on John Mark. Do you think Paul was an easy guy to be on a mission team with? He was probably a pain in the. One of the commentators another person that I read who did a biography on Paul from a female perspective said it's not a coincidence that more than one of Paul's attempts at a church plant ended in riots because he wouldn't shut his big mouth. Like he always had to have the last word, and he would be like, they would be like had just flogged him and then kicking him out of town, and then he would drop some mic bomb on him. So the point is, Paul's zeal, even though it did get rechanneled, it never stopped creeping up and causing him trouble. And then he goes on to say, and I guarantee you, if Paul would have been from Texas or Arizona, he would have said the cactus in the flesh. But they don't have cactuses in Judea. But he does use this image, right? He does use this image of a thorn in the flesh, and we don't know what it is. He doesn't give us any clue on it whatsoever. One of the commentators I read on this said it probably actually serves the church better that he didn't, because had he said it was an eye thing, or had he said it was whatever, malaria. There's countless theories on what it could have been. Only people with that condition would relate to it. But now, since he doesn't tell us what it is, we all can relate to it. We can all relate to this idea of a thorn in the flesh. But he says this. He says, because to keep me being conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations. And before he talks about his cactus, he talks about being taken to the seventh heaven and all these visions. And it's a weird kind of trippy thing that he talks about. But he says, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being what? Conceited. Keep me humble. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, what? My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then I am content with weakness, insults, hardship, persecutions, calamities. For what? When I am weak, then I am. So that is part of the cactus hugging journey, is embracing this weakness, embracing this ugliness. I argue in my thesis that Paul's thorn was his zeal. It was his zeal when it was unchecked. Because it's called what? A messenger of? What is word? The word Satan means accuser. That's what the word means. What could Satan accuse Paul of that would cause him the most damage? You remember back when Stephen was being stoned and you held the cloaks? Remember all the Christians you put in jail? Remember when you had it out with Barnabas, your best friend, the guy that was there for you? You remember when you gave up on John Mark? Oh, by the way, he's going to write he's going to write one of the Gospels. Like all these times that this zeal, all the time that his passion goes unchecked. I think that's what Satan could have attacked Paul with, that would have caused him the most damage emotionally. So I'm arguing that his thorn was an emotional thing. It was just this despair he felt over that. And because he'll go on later and say what? I am the chief of sinners. And he writes that after He writes that I'm the chief of sinners after he writes this. He goes on in Romans, because this is from 2 Corinthians. He goes on in Romans and says what? The good things I want to do, I don't do. The bad things I don't want to do, I keep doing. So he's acknowledging this brokenness and this disconnect. So the positive of his zeal, we have Christianity in most of the world now. The negative was pretty ugly. I mean, Paul's ugly side could be very ugly. And that's the whole point of this, is as an illustration for all of us. So Paul's thorn in the flesh, he calls it a messenger of Satan. It also says it was there to keep him humble, right? To keep him humble. And in the end, it says what? That he asks 3 times for it to be taken away, and the response he gives, my grace is sufficient. You're not going to depend on yourself. You're going to depend on my sufficient grace. And if you're going to hug your cactus, you better be able to depend on some sufficient grace, because when you face your dark side, it's pretty ugly. Okay, so 3 traditions that I kind of want to talk to you guys about that I used. So part 1, I guess you could say, of my thesis was you had to develop it biblically, theologically. Then you had to develop it from a literature standpoint. What have other people said about this topic? If you go to any personality profile, Myers-Briggs, DISC, whatever, and you read the description, it's going to have what? Positive qualities of that personality, and it's going to have what? Negative qualities. So if you want to know where your cactus is, just figure out your personality type. I think the Enneagram is the most holistic, but that's not the only one out there. It's the one that helped me the most. But figure out the negative qualities of that person, of that type, and that's going to be where your cactus is. I'm a 7, which is the enthusiast. They say in the Enneagram that every other Enneagram type wishes they were a different type except for the 7, and the 7 thinks everyone else should be a 7. Like, who wouldn't want to be a 7, right? But then you read the description of the enthusiast of the 7. It talks about being addicted to, everything. So, sobriety is what is the goal of the 7. So gluttony and it's not gluttony for food; it's just gluttony for life. It's just there's never enough. So we struggle with contentment as 7s. We struggle to be present and content in the moment. And how does that project itself? Addiction to attention, addiction to adrenaline, addiction to chaos. Right? So as I started, all these pieces started coming together in my mind. So if you, I think there's actually a presentation on the Enneagram here later today. If you want to learn more about the Enneagram itself, but that's a good place to go. And the Enneagram talks a lot about this wounded self. It talks a lot about the ego. In the research, it talks a lot about this childhood wound. Like where does this false sense of self originate? But that's what I developed it through there. So that's one tradition. Another tradition that I looked at was contemplative prayer, so contemplation and meditation. Dark Night of the Soul, a book by St. John of the Cross, who was a few years later than Luther, but kind of the same century, a Spanish mystic. But this guy, Gerald May, writes, a psychiatrist, he integrates, Dark Night of the Soul is heavy reading. I mean, but he makes it a little bit more accessible, this guy Gerald May, the concepts of the book. But it's kind of a parallel to the cactus, is this like your soul goes through this dark night. And he calls it dark, St. John of the Cross does, not because it's necessarily bad, not because it's evil, because it's hidden. And then so if you reach the point in your life, St. John of the Cross talks about where all the things that worked for you before, even your own approach to God, your own habits, prayer, whatever. If those things aren't working anymore, you're entering a dark night. Like it's like everything it's kind of falling apart. That's that. And then the 12 steps of recovery. That's pretty. And then that's in the movie that was the context, right? I will argue this, that there's a lot of parallels, and if you read the 12 steps, there's a lot of activities, behaviors that are parallel and helpful in the cactus hugging journey. I will say one's cactus and their addiction are not the same thing. Most people that have been through some type of, and Richard Rohr argues that everyone's addicted to something, right? There may not be a 12-step program for addiction to chaos. I haven't found it yet, but we're all addicted to something, right? We are. But the addiction is not. One of the problems we have with viewing addiction is that addiction is not the problem. Addiction is an attempted solution at a problem, right? So it's often an unhealthy, solution. But someone who's addicted to something is doing that because they're trying to resolve something deeper going on in their soul, and it's projecting itself in an addictive behavior. Now, so like for some people drink, and they become addicted, and they should never drink again. Some people go through seasons of what they call a type of alcoholism where they're just medicating. But once they heal that part of their soul, then they can go back to being what you call a social drinker. Now, I'm not advocating that people that have recovered from alcohol go back and drink. Counselors and other people need to sort that out for you. But the point is, a lot of times addictions can be an attempt at a solution. But so if someone's an alcoholic, I would not say that alcohol is their cactus. There's something deeper going on that they're drinking as an attempt to solution to that. And so in the movie Rocket Man, for example, you'll see that it was really a breakdown in relationships, especially with the approval and love of his father, and then this addiction to attention, probably for him, he creates this whole persona. But really, at the end of the day, he's just trying to get his father to say, "I love you." Everything that he does is basically back to this, and that was the core issue. So, if you treat the addiction as the cactus, you're not going deep enough. You got to go deeper. Like, what's triggering the addiction? What's triggering the behavior? Because your cactus is not a behavior. Your cactus is a part of your soul, right? It's what's triggering the behavior. So, in the handout I gave you guys, this one, there's the words of the speech from Robert Downey Jr. And there's for the purpose of my thesis, I broke the speech into 6 parts. So when life is not working, don't give up hope. Find a faith rooted in forgiveness. Take personal responsibility for your wrongdoings. Embrace the ugly parts of your soul. That's the cactus hugging part. Do this long enough and gain some humility, and then life will take on a new meaning. So that's the 6 parts of the speech. And then kind of a little sidebar to life taking on a new meaning, he says, help the next person. And that's so, but another way to look at this is to look at it as upward growth, right? Because what's amazing about a cactus is cactuses grow in the most unlikely place that anything would ever grow. Like, you go to Big Bend in South Texas, they can't grow grass in Phoenix, but you get cactuses everywhere, right? So out of this rocky kind of the worst possible imaginable comes what? This plant. And this plant that, like the cactus of Texas, the prickly pear, there's medicinal use. I mean, all these great things come out of cactus. And then you get these beautiful flowers. So self-imposed crisis is that's the baseline, right? And then if you long enough invest in not giving up hope, faith is rooted in forgiveness, taking personal responsibility, embracing the ugly part of self, what eventually will produce is humility and new meaning. So that's a different way of kind of, instead of just looking at the 6 parts, because I say the 6 parts it's not like step 1, step 2, they're integrated. So, but that's what that is all about. So, I want to talk about, just real quickly, before we get into some questions, is 2 approaches to prayer and meditation, because in order to, that's the part of the speech where he says, do it long enough. Like, you don't just hug your cactus, like, Paul did it 13 years. Like, you don't just, transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's a process. It can take months, years to unpack the brokenness that led to that. So what do you do with that time? Well, you meditate, you contemplate, you reflect on it. There's two approaches to this. Lectio Divina, which is called divine reading, that was developed in this Geigo II was this monk in the 12th century, and it's based on a ladder of 4 rungs. So you read the text, or you read a book or whatever that's on. You meditate on it, you pray, and then the eventual goal is to get to contemplation, where you kind of let go of self and just. But it's a ladder. You go up, you come back down, you go back up, and he even describes it a ladder to heaven. But Luther had a slightly different approach. Luther has what he calls prayer, oratio meditato tentato, and he calls prayer meditation trials. So, and he says usually it starts with prayer, but anywhere you can his is a circular approach. So it can start with meditation and then go to trial, then to prayer. It can start with prayer, meditation, trial. But the point is I love how the idea that if you are praying and you are meditating and you are engaging the Word of God and you're engaging yourself, it's going to create trials. Like there's going to be trials that come out of that, and then a messenger of Satan, right? So you can start with the trial. It's a circular approach to. But you're going to have to process yourself. You're going to have to spend some time with yourself. And for sevens, that's hard, because we want to just be spending time with everybody else. But for extroverts, that's hard, because we want to, But you got to do that. That soul work is time alone with just you and God, and why am I doing this? Why am I doing these behaviors? So that's a lot of that. And then some additional resources, and then that's on the page there. And then I want to end with this, and then we'll have some questions.
Your problem is
My problem was I believe you love me. You're incapable of it. I gave everything to keep something that I never even had in the first place. I always thought you was an introverted extrovert.
A what? He's shy. He's always been shy.
Thought his father's fault. Don't blame me. He'd have been strange regardless. Actually, I think I'm okay with strange. Both of you. Stop. I'm not going to allow you to do this anymore. It's about time you said that. Honey. I told you how much I need you. Now, I love you. Always have, always will. You write songs that millions of people love. That's what's important. You just need to remember who you are. And be okay with it.
Be okay with it.
It really is. Why not something like this job?
I thought you were Reggie Dwight.
These closed captions are horrible. I can't. I'm sorry. I have it as loud as it'll go. So when are you going to hug me is what he says. Before that he said, he goes, I thought you were Reggie Dwight. That's his name. And he goes, I haven't been Reggie Dwight in years. And then his childhood version of self says what? When are you going to hug me? You see, your cactus is you. So the whole point of hugging the cactus then is to integrate the ugly part of self into a holistic sense of self. It's not, and I kind of describe this two ways. Well, why do you hug your cactus? Aren't we supposed to deny self? Does deny self mean, when I did some focus groups on this, some people had a hard time with this. They were like, I thought I was supposed to abandon self. I thought I was supposed to hate the part of myself that's ugly. Well, if you hate this part of self that's ugly, guess what? You're hating part of yourself. And Paul makes it clear that part of self is what? Not going away. It's there. It's there for your humility. It's there for you to depend more on God's sufficient grace. So, how do you integrate that part of self, that shadow self, is by hugging it. And hugging it, I think, means two things. One, you hug it to limit its damage, to kind of rein it in, right? If you embrace something, you're kind of saying, I don't like when I act that way, so I'm going to rein that in. But it's all, just like with Paul, it's every once in a while it's going to what? It's going to rear its ugly head, right? It is. But so that's part of loving, hugging, is you love that ugly part of self. The other part is that you rein it in and you do love it. Why? Because it's not going away. It's in counseling they call it integration theory, like where you learn to integrate. Because what happened when Elton John was saying, I haven't been that guy for years, like there were two Elton Johns, right? There was the Rocket Man, and then there's this wounded child. And this wounded child, at the end, realizes he's never going to get that love from his father, and he comes to peace with that. And then when he comes to peace with that, he's able to what? Hug who he is. And he's still a Rocket Man. So it's an integration, right? It's not like all of a sudden he stopped wearing the fancy clothes. He didn't. He still was just as flamboyant as ever. So the three parts of the things that integrate, just really quickly, where are they really helpful? And this isn't in the notes, this is just bonus stuff, but like I said, the Enneagram or personality theory helps you find your cactus. Helps you identify your ugly part of self. These patterns of behaviors. The 12 steps are helpful, I think, in a couple ways. One is, when you go to a 12-step meeting, you have to what? You have to tell your story. Paul tells his story. Like he recaps, when he's arrested, he recaps the story of his conversion, right? In front of, 3 times at the end of Acts. And he tells it in the Galatians. So, a big part of hugging your cactus is being comfortable enough to share your story. Like for me to come in front of you guys and say, I was going to develop mission models, and I realized I had to work on myself. I had to realize I was in a pattern of behaviors where I was not treating people as well as I wanted to, and relationships were broken. I broke off an engagement. I'd been through a divorce. I was like, there was a pattern of my behavior. Like, the problem's me. So, telling the story helps you, and that's one of the beauty of the 12 steps, is the 12 steps force you in a way to tell a story. There's a really good, on that list of resources, if you want to dive into the whole idea of storytelling, Spirituality of Imperfection by Kurtz and Ketchum. A wonderful book. Now, it has illustrations that are from a variety of faith backgrounds, so it's not uniquely Christian, but there's a lot of Christian in it. But it's a great resource for the whole idea of the importance of telling stories. There's some other resources. So that's where that comes. Contemplative prayer helps you in that part of the cactus hugging journey where to do it long enough. The idea that you need to reflect on yourself. And a lot of times that requires like a spiritual guide, a spiritual director, a counselor, and in the sense of community, right? That's the other thing that 12 steps really helps bring out, is the sense of community, right? You can't go through the cactus hugging journey alone. In the video of Robert Downey Jr., he didn't come up with that on his own, right? Someone else had to tell him, you go hug your cactus. That would be my friend. So these things happen in community. So, and then that's helpful. Yes, sir. You have a question?
Yes, your story. That's a great idea. And my story was humility of ministry.
Right.
My mother tried to teach me humility, and she said, Roy, somewhere along the line, someone is liable to tell you that you had a good sermon. I doubt if anyone ever will. I did pretty well.
Right.
Okay. She said, you be sure to tell them it's not you, it's the Holy Spirit.
Right.
Well, sure enough, this nice lady walked out one Sunday morning. She said, Pastor, that was a fine sermon. I remember what my mom said. I said, Catherine, still remember her name. It wasn't me, it was the Holy Spirit. And she talked for a minute, and she says, Pastor, it wasn't that good.
I love it. I love it. I love it. So yeah, so it's integrating all of these. Any more questions? We got about 7-8 minutes for questions. Any or thoughts? Or yeah, go ahead. I have one more copy that you can have, and like I said, they are all the resources are also on my on the website. So yeah.
I was going to ask you what Enneagram you thought Paul was.
You know, I think he was a 1.
You probably thought that.
I think he's a 1, and actually Richard Rohr, who is a Catholic writer, he argues that Paul was a 1, was a 1. So, yeah. So most people that have dealt with Paul on the Enneagram label him a 1. I've seen a couple others like 8s or whatever, but you're an 8. I'm a 7 with an 8 wing. So,
I'm a wing 7.
Yeah. So anyways, any other questions, any comments? I'm happy to stay back and talk. If you'd like a Hug Your Cactus shirt, you can come get one of those if you'd like. Otherwise, I think I'm done. Let me pray for you guys for the rest of your session. And once again, Hug Your Cactus, integrate, embrace the ugly part of self, integrate it, learn to limit its damage. And I think this is a really good resource, I mean, for a lot of people, because there's a lot of brokenness out there, right? There's a lot of people that are struggling. I went on a prayer retreat with pastors a couple weeks ago, and then we were on our way to the retreat, literally getting ready to go, and then one of the brothers was having a complete, total meltdown, a pastor friend of mine, and he needed to hug his cactus, and he was going through depression, anxiety, couldn't get up and preach on a Sunday morning. So me and one other guy took him and did a separate retreat, just the 3 of us, and we were unpacking some of this stuff. And on my way to retreat, I posted on Facebook, hey, I'm going on a prayer retreat. Send me your prayer requests. And you realize, I don't do soul care well. This is hard for me. Like the thought of having to do a hospital visit, I'm like, I'll take waterboarding. But so I never thought I'd be speaking on soul care. But as I've learned to hug my cactus, I've embraced. I got over 20 requests. Just people texting me, emailing me, like, Christian, you pray for this. There's just a lot of hurt. There's a lot of brokenness. There's a lot of people coming out of COVID and trying to make sense of this world. And I think this metaphor can be very helpful, not just in taking care of your own soul, kind of, well, what is that? What part of myself is ugly? What part of myself keeps kind of rearing its ugly head and doing damage to self and others? But also, as you come across people and you realize, that person is, their life isn't working and it's their fault. Are they ready to come to terms with that? And that's the hard part in this, is like, if someone's not ready to come to terms with the fact their life isn't working, you can't convince them, right? But you can point them in that right direction. And that's the importance of community there. So let me pray for us. Dear God, thank you for this day. It's so interesting, Lord, that you gave Paul a thorn in the flesh. You allowed a messenger of Satan to torment him, and when he asked for it to be taken away, you said no, that your grace was sufficient. So help us to live based on your sufficient grace, your sufficient grace, so that we can, walk through this journey, that we can seek to be people of humility, seek to have new meaning in our lives, that we can embrace these ugly parts of ourselves, that we can integrate faith and hope and all those things. So pray all these things in your Son's name. Amen. And then, the very part of that, he says hope. Hope is super important. But then when I was doing this, one of my focus groups, one of the ladies said, but I think sometimes, and she was a chaplain at a hospital, she said, sometimes we can move off of hopelessness too soon. Like, actually, hopelessness can be transformed. That's one of the questions on the thing is, and I was like, that's what I do. That's addiction to adrenaline and chaos is I ignore my hopelessness. But some hopelessness can be despair, like the Psalms of Lament. Those can be hugely transformative. So you don't want to stay in hopelessness too long. But for me, I tend to not stay in hopelessness long enough. So and then once again, that you learn these things as you figure out your personality type or whatever. So, all right, thanks guys.
Thank you.